You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, television, Broadway, and showbiz stories, and maybe even a little bit of news and gossip with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, and Stephen J. Rubin. Today, we're looking at medical TV shows. Is there a doctor in the house? And now, here's Steve.
Hi, everybody. I found this subject very dear to my heart because one of my first jobs in life is I worked in a hospital. I was a student at UCLA and I applied for a job to be a telephone operator in their communications department. And it's interesting. I think the popularity of medical TV shows over the years is directly related to the fact that there's so much drama in the hospital environment, and TV, movies, whatever, thrives on drama. And I had a little bit of in the communication shack because I was responsible for calling doctors in all over the time sphere. And I would sometimes call doctors when they were in the midst of their personal lives. And it was a little embarrassing, but I got them to do the job and it was fun. But the emergencies all the time, I mean, you are definitely on your toes because anytime somebody calls up and says there's a cardiac arrest in 4 West CCU, we got on the pagers, we got on the overhead projector. But that has nothing to do with the TV series at the moment. I'm going to refer to Julian because Julian will dive into the earliest that he remembers a medical show.
Yeah, it was in the early 50s. It was called City Hospital. It was first on ABC, then it was on CBS, and in those days, sometimes both networks played the same show. It was really a wild time in the early television. This is 51. And there were the amazing thing about City Hospital, very rare, was there was a man and a woman doctor. The woman doctor, and that was very unusual at that time to show a woman doctor, even know there was a woman doctor. So that was kind of exciting. And on the show, Eva Marie Saint was on the show before On the Waterfront, and the wonderful director who was an actor first, Martin Ritt, was on that show. So it was an interesting thing for a kid to watch, as I did. And the other show that was very early was a show called The Doctor. Now, The Doctor was a different kind of a show. It was a half-hour show. And I don't know if you remember, you guys, Warner Anderson. Warner Anderson was the lead actor on a show called The Lineup. Probably played 6-7 years on CBS. Very good detective show. He and his partner Tom Tully. Anyhow, Warner Anderson was at this point the host of the show, and on the show was Lee Marvin as a guest, Charles Bronson as a guest, Ann Jackson as a guest, Mildred Natwick, and who wrote 2 episodes of The Doctor? Rod Serling. But the most interesting thing about The Doctor for me was of those 44 episodes, 17 were directed by Robert Aldrich. Now, we know how important a director he was, but think about it. I said, who was some of the people? Charles Bronson. Who else? Lee Marvin. We're talking years later about The Dirty Dozen, 2 of the stars. Aldrich knew them from all the way back in the 50s. So it's an interesting thing to start out. Arthur, what were your early shows? You remember any early doctor shows?
I not long ago, it seems to me, I saw a Dr. Kildare from the early 1930s. This movie was so old, Lionel Barrymore was walking. He was walking. That's how old it was. For those who remember Lionel Barrymore. There's always been a doctor show on television. I don't think there's any year that's gone without one. And some of them have been massive hits, like Marcus Welby, MD. I mean, Dr. Kildare, of course, Richard Chamberlain recently died. Ben Casey was huge, right? Was it called Ben Casey?
Yes, it was
Yes,
called Ben
absolutely
Casey.
called Ben Casey.
Medical shows were part of the tent pole of Hollywood. There was the medical show, there was the lawyer show, and there was the cop show. You could say that each era has their each era every year has their medical show, their cop show, and their lawyer show. I think whereas movies, at least in the old days, movies could be very, they're all different types of movies, eclectic. TV is about repetition. If something's successful one year, they do it again the next year. I mean, this has nothing to do with medical shows, but look at Law and Order. Law and Order has been on forever, and they keep doing episodes, new shows.
Nothing's longer than General Hospital,
General
which has
Hospital.
been on for 52 years and is still running. This gives longevity a new meaning.
Wasn't the show, guys? Wasn't the show that was in the movie Tootsie a medical show?
It was.
And what was the name of the doctor who wanted to kiss him all the time? The guy who was in Police Academy.
Richard Mulligan was the actor.
No, I know, but the doctor, the guy who played the guy who wanted to kiss Dustin Hoffman.
That was Richard Mulligan. I'm pretty sure it was.
No, I'm talking about the guy from Police Academy.
Oh, maybe it wasn't Richard Mulligan.
He sang Some Enchanted Evening.
Yeah, it was
right outside the window. Yeah,
he was hysterical. That guy was hysterical. But that was the background of it. There's always been a doctor show on, guys. I have worked a good deal with a writer named Paul Attanasio some years ago, and Paul came up with the idea for House. He created it, wrote it with his wife Katie Jacobs. House was a big success. MASH was a doctor show, was it not? Just happened to take place in Korea.
Absolutely.
It's definitely a doctor show, and it's acknowledged as one of the 10 best of all time. But getting back to Kildare, for those of our listeners who are more familiar with the TV show than the movie, it started out in radio and then became a movie series with Lionel Barrymore, and Lou Ayres was the first Dr. Kildare. And Lou Ayres is an interesting actor. He had become a star after he was in, I think he did Greta Garbo's last silent film, and then he starred in Louis Milestone's All Quiet on the Western Front, and then he got the role to play Dr. Kildare, and he continued, I think he did like 7 or 8 movies, and then World War II broke out, because his movies ran from 37 to 42, and he was a conscientious objector in World War II, and this did not play well in the country in 1942, so they stopped making those movies. Now, when the TV series came to be in the 1960s, they wanted him to play the part that Raymond Massey later played of Dr. Gillespie, but he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it.
Oh,
you know why he didn't want to do it? Yeah.
I think he did the pilot and it didn't sell. That's my belief. Yeah.
Well, the reason I heard later that he didn't want to do the series was he didn't want to have any cigarette ads.
Yes.
He was a man with very strong views on a number of subjects. So they ended up getting Raymond Massey. And of course, the combination of Raymond Massey and this upstart actor, Richard Chamberlain, God rest his soul, we just lost him recently, was a powerful combination that led to rating success.
Do you know who the first person they offered Kildare to, who turned it down?
I think it was Bill Shatner, wasn't it?
Exactly. And the second person?
James Franciscus.
This man wins the prize.
Guys, you remember the TV ads? The TV ads years ago in the 60s, maybe sooner, or I'm sure earlier, that had the doctor standing in front of us saying, 9 out of 10 doctors who smoke Camels, or whatever the hell the cigarette was.
That's right.
Like it was healthy to smoke, It was unbelievable.
That was it. One of the other early shows that I remember as a kid was with Richard Boone, clean shaven, no beard, no mustache, called Medic, Medic, Medic. And it was, once again, who's on the show? On guest stars, Lee Marvin, Charles Bronson, Lee J. Cobb, Robert Vaughn. all these guys are doing all these early TV shows as young men, kind of honing their trade, so to speak.
But Julian, Lee Marvin, Charles Bronson, there were several other guys who were around for years and not yet stars.
That's
around
right.
for years and became superstars. Lee Marvin, Charles Bronson, and there's another guy that's in there.
Well, I know Cassavetes was there doing shows as a young man as well.
Yeah,
There was a lot. There were a lot.
they
I mean,
all played
I
live
just watched
TV.
I just watched a Perry Mason the other night. There's Robert Redford as the young boy in the show. You know that.
Redford did them all. He did all of
And
those
he
series.
did a Kildare. My theory about doctor shows is they're pretty cheap. You don't really have to go outside, so you don't have to leave the set. You build a doctor set, a few rooms, an operating room, a communication center, and then you're in the pink, don't you think?
Yeah, I do. The 1961 was the year for Dr. Kildare from MGM, but it was also the year for Ben Casey. So the two huge, giant shows in 61 were Casey and Kildare. An amazing thing about that was the guy who wrote Medic, his name was James Moser, Moser, also wrote Ben Casey. So he was coming out, he was really the man for that particular moment. Sam Jaffe, we know, was the older man in Ben Casey, and his wife was Betty Ackerman, who played as in that show as well. So that was kind of interesting. The last year of Ben Casey, a doctor came on named Franchot Tone. He came on at the end in his last year. So it was great to find this out as a kid, looking at these shows. Of course, by Ben Casey time, I was no longer a kid.
Well, how about Vince Edwards, who was around for years in little roles in movies? I think Vince Edwards may have been in The Killing, Stanley Kubrick's The Killing. I think he was always in little roles, and all of a sudden he becomes a huge star. I mean, Ben Casey was a big hit.
Yeah, it was a huge hit. Bing Crosby Productions had it, by the way. I want you to know. And on top of it, Sidney Pollack directed for that. Irvin Kershner directed for that. So it wasn't just the actors who were cutting their teeth, early teeth. It was many directors that went through there, early television. We know Arthur Penn, we know John Frankenheimer, but I don't know what shows they did besides You Are There and things like that. But I know specifically Pollack and Kershner did Ben Casey.
And Arthur, you're right. Vince Edwards was one of the stars of the 1956 movie The Killing.
The Killing, yeah.
Early
Yeah,
Stanley Kubrick.
Well, here's the thing, guys. Let me just say this. The simple fact of the matter is that medical shows have an audience because sooner or later, everybody in this world is going to go to a doctor or have some kind of medical thing. And we all relate to it, and they're able to use so many different plots. And the public at large, we kind of see that situation where it's like, warnings that are coming, or people have these problems, and we always admire doctors, and there's so much to this that I can see why they've been successful forever and will continue to be. Is there one on now, by the way, Steve? Would you know that?
Yeah, there's a number of them on now. Well, first of all, Grey's Anatomy is, I believe, still running. It's 438 episodes. And Mike, isn't Grey's Anatomy still around? Yeah.
How great was St. Elsewhere?
St. Elsewhere was a big hit.
I think ER was one of the big ones, and not only George Clooney, but Juliana Margulies came out of that. I mean, that was around for 6-7 years.
Oh, much longer than that, Julian. Much longer. I think it was 12 seasons or 13 seasons. That was kind of my show, the one that I always seemed to. I was not really a medical show in the early years. I mean, I was more inclined to watch Lost in Space or Star Trek or The Twilight Zone. But when ER came on, because ER, first of all, the pedigree was great. It was created by Michael Crichton, the same writer who had written Jurassic Park and Westworld, and I guess
Coma.
Coma. He worked in a hospital, so Michael really knew that world. And it's funny, George Clooney, who we'll be talking about in an upcoming show because we all love Clooney. He had done a number of TV shows and had not much success with them. I mean, we think of Clooney today as being, as Arthur says, the closest we've got to, or you said it, Julian, the closest we have to Cary Grant. But there was something that didn't work with Clooney, and then he shows up in ER. He got a hair.
Because he cut his hair.
He cut
Okay,
his
it's
hair.
right.
He suddenly was like everybody's hall pass.
He had a very good supporting role on Roseanne's show, and
Right.
but he didn't break through.
Didn't break through. And then he shows up in ER as Doug Ross, the pediatrician, and having him with kids and all that pathos. You do a medical show, there's lots of pathos.
Steve, was he a star of that show at the outset, or did he just develop into one?
Well, it was an ensemble show, as you know, and I think that I think people just gravitated toward him, and then it just built on that. I mean, TV doesn't, well, they don't create stars like George Clooney that often, and I think it was a big thing. But that show was just really well done. I think people really saw it as NBC said, appointment television.
Well,
Was it a half hour or an hour?
1 hour.
Mm-hmm.
Steve, this is probably the very first time in all the shows we've done together that I have to disagree. I think TV has created an enormous amount of stars, enormous. So,
Well, has it ever? Oh,
well,
boy.
I obviously I was exaggerating, Julian, but I think they don't make a Clooney that often. Clooney is a step above. I mean, how many? I mean, sure, they made a Clint Eastwood, of course. He starred in television, became a huge star, and but Clooney is different. I think Clooney was a star for I guess you'd say the late '90s. He was just something new.
he
became a
We'll definitely
superstar.
talk about him next week.
Yeah,
We definitely will.
Clooney became a
2 weeks.
superstar, but TV does make stars. Ask Lucille Ball. She was in movies for a long time, didn't become a real star until television.
Not to mention the guys on Saturday Night Live. I mean, think of it. Bill
God.
Murray and John Belushi, and I mean, it just goes on and on.
Eddie
Adam
Murphy.
Sandler,
Yeah.
all of them. It goes on and on. But more importantly, I don't know, more importantly, but importantly, as far as I'm concerned, I grew up worshiping, as my parents did, doctors. And as the years went by, they lost a lot of their cachet, that they weren't the God. They didn't, when they talked, it wasn't from the mountain after a while. And then holistic came in, and holistic kind of medicine. And now you go to a doctor and you can look up your own disease and talk to him about it before you even go in. And they got creamed on medical insurance. The doctors themselves had to pay fortunes of money. I have 2 doctor friends, both who retired early because of the cost they had to pay of medical insurance themselves.
Well, right around the corner, and just prepare yourself for it, will be the AI doctor, which is not as far off as you might think. You'll be talking to somebody and you'll be talking about your case, and the person will be sympathetic and giving you advice, and it won't be a person.
Or as Lyndon McMahon, the head of the Board of Education in the United States, called it, A1.
Not the sauce.
Read AI as A1. Gives you a lot of confidence. There was a doctor. A guy comes to his office. He says, "Doctor, I got a terrible problem. I think I'm a dog." And the doctor said, "Sit." That's what the doctor said, Steve. So let's also, for a moment, talk about some great doctor movies, feature films.
Well, to me, one of the greatest, if we're going to go in that direction, Arthur, you gotta talk about Paddy Chayefsky and the hospital.
The hospital.
It's one of the. It's kind of billed as a dark comedy, but it's George
Was
C.
it
Scott.
accurate from what you saw in your time in the hospital, Steve?
Yes. From my limited perspective, being a telephone operator, but George C. Scott, hot off of winning the Oscar and then refusing it for Patton, he plays Dr. Herbert Bach, and Bach is just burnt out. He's the perennial doctor who he's one of the major players in this mid-city hospital. I think it takes place in Boston. I think so.
That's New York in the hospital.
Was it New York? Was it the hospital?
Yeah.
Anyway, he's on the edge, and Shaefsky, as we all know, is one of the great, brilliant writers of the 20th century, and Patty just did a beautiful screenplay of how crazy hospitals can be. I mean, there's a scene where Bach is talking to the wonderful Diana Rigg, who is also fresh off the Avengers TV series. She plays his paramour, and he starts ranting about we've created the greatest medical establishment in the history of science. We can create life ectogenically. We do this, we do that. And then he says, people are sicker than ever. And that George C. Scott rant goes on and on. It's just incredible.
Let me interrupt you for a moment, Steve. I
Yes.
believe the year was 1970. I was the branch manager for the United Artists in Boston. We had the movie. And so Howard Godfrey, to produce it, came up to do some publicity and stuff. Howard and I got along very well. He says, you got to come down to New York. We'll have lunch at the Carnegie. I want you to meet Patty. All right, so I went to New York. I had some business there the next week. Anyway, I go in, and there was Patty Chayefsky and Howard sitting in a jam-packed Carnegie delicatessen, eating pastrami sandwiches. God knows what. We had a fun time. And I asked Patty, in your research, guys, is this true? Are these things actually happening? Well, Patty went bananas. You didn't see shit compared to what's happening. Are you kidding? You have no idea. We couldn't put half of the stuff into the movie. These things that they showed in that film, which were a horror, I mean, it was frightening, are just some of the things that they observed through research. It's true. I mean, what you saw happens in hospitals. My father-in-law, God rest in peace, was the head of anesthesiology at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. I had to go to a hospital for some kind of a thing, and I was in the emergency room, and they wheeled me to a room. And as the guy was wheeling me, he was circling and going zigs and zags. He didn't speak English, so I mentioned it to my father. I said, this is what happened to me. He said, well, there's only one way to prevent it. I said, what's that? He said, don't get sick. Because these hospitals are, they're worlds of their own. Mass General at that time in the 80s had 5,000 employees. Today, I'm sure there are more. They're worlds, and not all of it. These things can happen.
We often gravitate towards things we're fearful of. I mean, look at horror movies. But I think your average person probably is a little fearful of hospitals. I think we've all been trained to be that way a little bit, or at least guarded about what's going to happen, especially in this post-COVID world where all these germs are everywhere.
Well, that's true. And we mentioned earlier the television show of MASH, but that movie was an incredible success with one of the great ad campaigns and written by Ring Lardner, who did not do the television show, but the great Larry Gelbart did write it. And it was quite a success, one of the biggest successes of any medical show. And it was interesting. Wayne Rogers was the original co-star with Alan Alda, and I asked him why he left. It was such a hit. And he said it was supposed to be even between Alan and myself. And it turned out that Alan was getting all the attention, and I wanted to go on. I think, in retrospect, in my opinion, it was a gigantic mistake.
But there again, Julian, Alan Alda became a star through television. MASH.
Absolutely.
He had been around. He had been around, and That was it. There was a movie I recall, the melodrama called Not as a Stranger with Sinatra,
Oh,
Bob
and
Mitchum.
Robert Mitchum, and
That
Stanley.
was a hit movie. Gloria
Yeah,
Graham.
big hit. Oh yeah.
There were young doctors. There was a movie called
Charles
Young Doctors at
Bickford.
one time.
Charles Bickford was the old doctor in it. Yeah.
Yeah. Ever see
Well,
Charles
those
Bickford in anything that he wasn't great? He was
no,
always great.
always great. Well, young doctor shows were very popular in the early '60s. And movie-wise, you had the interns, and then you had the new interns, and with great casts. I mean, Cliff Robertson was the lead star in one of those. Those were very popular. The other thing that doctor shows and medical shows do is they mix it in with a little bit of soap opera. The things that go on in these hospitals get a little soapy at times. Hospital romance, hospital love stories, hospital infidelity.
Well, that stuff really happens too. So it's
Yes,
easy to do.
yes,
They're
yes.
very close, very close and closely involved.
There was another show like MASH with, I believe it was Dana Delaney. Was it called China Beach?
Yes.
Yes.
Also
Yeah.
medical. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was Vietnam, not Korea. I think, yeah, Mike's giving me the thumbs up. So yeah, it was definitely, yeah. So you started having women in the medical shows taking on lead parts. I think that was one of the hallmarks, by the way, of the ER TV series, is that women, it wasn't just about male doctors. There were a lot of female doctors, female administrators. It was the beginning of the emergence of a strong female part in these roles. These were not just breathless nurses. These were doctors who were there holding their own.
There's a book that was called Woman Doctor that my wife, that Barbara and I have optioned. A true story about a woman, Florence Hazeltine, who started out. She was like the first woman in an intern class of about 103 men. She was a woman, and what she had to go through, and this is in the late 60s, early 70s, to become a doctor is unthinkable, but it's in the book. The key to the story is that she eventually succeeds and becomes one of the heads of the National Institute of Health. And a lot of these doctors who screwed with her so badly have to come to her for funding. So it's a story. One day we'll hopefully get this thing made. But women doctors today, my doctor's a woman, and there are so many women doctors. Why not?
Why
But
not?
years ago, that was not the case.
Not the case at all. He's right.
Julian, you mentioned, or Arthur mentioned earlier, Michael Crichton's Coma. Coma is another movie where you really are become a little frightened how hospitals operate, especially if they have agendas like the story in Coma. Did you like that one, Arthur?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it was all right. Did a little business. Wasn't there something called Flatliners too? Was that the movie or was that a topic?
Flatliners was medical students doing research into coming back from the dead. It was not
Oh,
really
right.
a
Yeah.
medical show per se.
That was a
Yeah.
movie with Kevin Bacon
Yeah.
and, that crew.
Kiefer Sutherland.
Exactly. Julia
Yeah.
Roberts.
Right, right.
There's doctor shows, there's lawyer shows, there's police shows. There's not one about plumbing. I don't know. Is there one about plumbing? Somebody?
Well, I remember Art Carney worked in a sewer on the Jackie
That's
Gleason
right.
show. That's
He
about as
did.
close as it got.
You mean Ed Norton worked on the sewer?
That's right. Ed Norton. Norton.
Yeah.
You couldn't call the Elephant Man a doctor show movie, could you? Great
No.
movie, by the
You,
way.
you,
Yeah.
you really couldn't. But there's been shows like Nip Tuck that did very well on television. Nip Tuck was on for a while, and I think we mentioned Chicago Hope. You remember Pernell Roberts left Bonanza and did a show called Trapper John. Remember that?
Yes.
Trapper John MD, that was on for a while. And so he had
That's
that.
isn't that a MASH spinoff? Isn't that was
Well,
that
I don't think he was on a horse.
It
Oh,
technically was a, MASH spinoff. It was basically, playing the same character, Trapper John, but like 30 years later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he came,
What is the
came
plot
back
of
from
Grey's
Korea.
Anatomy, Steve? Grey's Anatomy.
What about Grey's Anatomy, Arthur?
Tell me about it. What makes it so successful?
Well, it seems to check all the boxes. Now, I looked it up, 438 episodes and counting. So this is a show that's been literally on forever. I think that it's produced some actors that became part of the zeitgeist. I mean, Dr. Dreamy, these are characters that extended beyond just the show.
Steve, hold on. It's McDreamy.
Oh, excuse me. McDreamy. Okay. Thank you, Mike. Because I'm cut to the quick here because I don't watch Grey's Anatomy, so I don't know it as well. So Arthur, you should probably ask Mike, what's the key to Grey's Anatomy success? Tell us, Mike.
Okay, I will. Mike?
Well, no, Grey's Anatomy, I haven't watched it in years, but it just keeps on going because it's the life of a hospital in Seattle. And basically they have characters who've been on since the beginning, but they've also bring in new doctors every year and new storylines. And there's been some amazing stories, throughout the years, and they're not afraid to kill off main characters either, which is kind of interesting.
A writer's dream, huh?
Yeah.
Boy, they have staffs of writers for these shows.
There was a movie I did not see, but maybe one of the three of you did, called The Good Nurse, with Jessica Chastain and Eddie Redmayne. Did anybody see it? I know I didn't. No.
Heard of it, did not see it.
No, but there's a couple other series more recently. There was Nurse Jackie, which came out not that long ago.
Is that Edie Falco, Mike?
Edie Falco,
yeah.
exactly, from The Sopranos. And that was interesting.
What's the show with the young man who's on the spectrum? Is that called Doctor?
Doctor, yeah. Doctor, or something like that.
Wasn't there one, Doogie Howser?
Doogie Howser, MD.
Oh, yeah, the young doctor. That's a good one.
Yep,
Yeah.
that had Neil Patrick Harris in the lead
Right.
when he was still a kid.
That's where he became a movie star.
Exactly. And then
Anybody here know the plot and the magic of Saint Elsewhere?
Well, St. Elsewhere was amazing. It was a great show, and that brought us a lot of, up and coming celebrities.
What was the plot of that, Steve?
Isn't that also
Mike?
Was that Stephen Bochco who also did Hill Street Blues?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
And that was a Boston hospital that it took place in. And it had people like Howie Mandel, Denzel Washington, a lot of names were in that series. And it was pretty amazing. Then you guys have brought up ER, but then you also had Scrubs, which was a sitcom about doctors.
Yeah, with Zach Braff.
Yep, exactly. And that went through two different networks and lasted, I think, 7 years. And they're actually talking about bringing it back.
Got a great movie that we've not mentioned here yet. That had a lot to do with medical, and that was called The Verdict, which had to do with a lawsuit.
Medical case, yes.
Which in Boston, the actual lawsuit took place in Beth Israel Hospital. They changed it around and made it a Jesuit hospital. But the story is true. It actually happened. If you look in that movie, by the way, very close to some of the scenes in court, you'll see that one of the people in the background sitting there is Bruce Willis before he was Bruce Willis. Just a little bit of trivia.
That's
great movie. Do we all agree? Sidney Lumet?
Great
Verdict?
movie. Mammoth, great script.
David Mamet, yeah.
Yeah. It was really
Why aren't they
good.
making that movie anymore, guys? What happened? Why don't we see things like
That's not
the
today's
thing is-
topic.
I think that yes, we'll get into that on another show, Arthur. But it is a good question. I know that early on, going back to the '60s, particularly on the Ben Casey show, even the president of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was cooperating and suggesting ideas to the writers of Ben Casey to deal with medical issues at that time, like drug addiction, that they were battling, the Great War on Drugs. And they featured those stories in some of the episodes, and it was helpful to get the word out. You know, you do a public service announcement when everybody turns off, spend millions of dollars on these public service campaigns, and then you put it on a show that's watched by 20 million people every week. That achieves the purpose more than a public service announcement.
One of the movies we could talk about that technically certainly has medical in it is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yes.
Which incredible story on that. Kirk Douglas starred on Broadway with it and owned the rights and tried for years to get it made and was unable to get it made. And Michael Douglas, his son, said, "Let me try." And he got it done with Saul Zaentz, and they got the film done. I saw it, and when Kirk Douglas in the play came out with just a towel on, it was at a Wednesday matinee, and the women swooned. They swooned.
Well,
There was also the fellow who played Billy Bibbit, the stutterer, was an unknown actor named Gene Wilder, was in that cast.
oh, wow.
And the big Will Sampson role, the big role of the Native American, was played by Ed Ames of the Ames Brothers.
Yes.
So, hey, you want to talk about some trivia? There's some.
Is that the Ed Ames who throws the tomahawk on the Johnny
That's right.
Carson show?
Same man. Same man.
Frontier Briss.
That's why he felt he had the right to throw a tomahawk.
Well, you know, that movie, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, celebrates its 50th anniversary this year.
And I think if you look closely, you'll see Danny DeVito.
Danny
of course.
DeVito.
A good
Hasn't
role in
grown
that
an
movie.
inch in 50 years.
50 years. Really? Wow. You know, so here's the thing. That movie, the whole perception of it before it came out was, how could you possibly make a movie like this and think it's going to do business? You got to be kidding. It's insane guys. And it was always all that negativity until it opened and went through the roof. But again, that was at a time.
You have to hand it to Saul Zaentz. He didn't make many movies, but he made not only Cuckoo's Nest, he made the great Amadeus he produced as well.
Julian, he's probably as passionate a man as has ever been in the arts. I love Saul Zaentz. I got to know him, and boy, was he special. Made a lot of money in the music business out of San Francisco, but Amadeus, yes. And he also had I think he had a Lord of the Rings with a guy named Al Brodax, which was an animated film in the 70s. That was very successful.
That became a Ralph Bakshi animated
Ralph Bakshi,
film.
And Saul produced that. But Saul was just a giant.
He was also in a giant lawsuit with John Fogerty of Creedence Clearwater Revival. There was some kind of ownership situation where John Fogerty did not perform for 10 years, I think, because he was in this huge dispute with Saul over the ownership of his records. It was a very kind of a tragic story. Obviously, John Fogerty came back and started to perform again. But The Lord of the Rings, he eventually sold the rights to the Weinsteins. And they're the ones, of course, who made The Lord of the Rings for the new line. But Cuckoo's
that's true.
Great film. Great film.
What was the name of the guy who played the stutterer of
in the movie? It was Brad,
who had a little career for a while,
who was also in The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah,
played Grima Wormtongue.
Gee, I can't believe it's 50 years. Honest to God,
it's 50.
We get a lot of these things that happen, but it doesn't seem that long ago. Jack Nicholson was a movie star of movie stars. One of the greats of all time.
What made that movie was Nicholson, because I think that it was just a tour de force. And then the woman who played Nurse Ratched was just wonderful too.
She was so great it became
Louise Fletcher, absolutely.
And she became a thing like Nurse. There was Nurse Ratched became like a Jello, It became a name for a woman who was like that way, It was just terrible.
It's interesting. I watched it for the first time in a long time a couple weeks ago, And I was particularly watching her performance as to, is she really the jerk that you think she is? And coming away from it, seeing it after all these years, I realized that she was just doing her job. Now, she's a hard ass, and certainly her relationship with Billy Bibbit was very critical to what happens to him. But I was more sympathetic to her character when I saw it again.
Did she ever do anything beyond that movie?
Oh, sure. She made other movies.
She did.
But,
She actually, I was just going to say, Julian, that she swallows a frog in the remake of Invaders from Mars, but that was the low light.
or maybe the high. But one of the things we have to remember, the importance, as we all know in drama, is if you have a wild man like Jack Nicholson, you need an antagonist. You can't handle it without an antagonist, in fact. So there
You
she
can't
was.
take the truth.
Guys, just an aside, Barbara and I watched A Few Good Men the other night. Just having seen it, we'd seen it several times before. Hadn't seen it in many years. What a great movie. And Nicholson seeing that particular scene in the courtroom, nothing quite like it. Before or after, what a scene. Great movie. Speaking of that, again, we come up with these great movies. They come from a period of time that eliminates, I think, from the 2000s on, there just haven't been any of those things that were there in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s, these great story-driven movies, and they're missing badly.
Well, getting back to hospital TV shows, I want to just mention for a second Marcus Welby. I mean, Robert Young back in the 60s, going all the way back to Father Knows Best. I mean, was there an actor who was more respected as your favorite family member than Robert Young? And for him to become a doctor was a natural fit for him. Were you a fan of the Welby Show, Arthur?
Not really. I didn't watch it much, but just clarify, was Robert Young in Marcus Welby?
He was Marcus
played
Welby.
Marcus
And
Welby.
Josh Brolin was the young guy, right?
Actually, James Brolin was his
James
father.
Brolin.
Was the young guy. Yeah, that broke James Brolin as an actor star.
Yeah. The Father Knows Best thing was, well, when you look at that show today, probably it looks ridiculous. Like, Beaver Cleaver, those kind of shows are so innocent and so completely opposite of what the hell's happened here. But they were the innocent thing about these medical shows is those were the really innocent, nice kind of doctor stuff. Today it's become very gritty, and you see everything there is to see in the hospital.
Well, I think that they were very educational at a time when we didn't have the internet. I mean, most people back in the 60s knew very little about medicine per se. I mean, your average person didn't, unless they had a medical encyclopedia on their desk, they kind of deferred to these medical shows to learn things. I'm sure a lot of real life doctors would complain that their clients were getting too much information from the show and not enough from the real doctors. Don't you agree, Julian?
I do. And going back to the fact, we have to remember, Arthur, that they weren't all nice. Ben Casey was one tough doctor, a brilliant neurosurgeon, but hostile. He could get angry. He was, I think what made that show so good was the fact that he was a human being, not just a great guy,
And so different from the doctor shows that came out of the 50s,
right?
Where the really innocent things took place. I want to mention, guys, living in Boston, I got to know an ER doctor pretty well, a young guy, and he told me what it was like. Was that every time the door opened, you never knew what was coming in. Very big hospital in Boston. And you can imagine that. Who's coming in on Saturday night at 2:00 in the morning? The door springs open, and all of a sudden you see blood.
Well, that's your hallmark of medical shows. You never know what's coming in. I think they were unpredictable, and I think that made them interesting. ER captured me because of that very fact. But I would have to say also the people who were the lead actors on on ER were an interesting group of people, very interesting, and they all had distinct characters that made that show work. Noah Weil, who was the young doctor opposite Clooney, he kind of grew up on that show, and I really enjoyed his performance every week. And then Juliana Margulies, who we mentioned earlier, she was terrific, and Maura Tierney had the role of the lead nurse, and she was always a great person to watch her.
It's interesting that you brought up Noah Wiley because he's on a new medical show called The Pit, which is on HBO currently.
Which is hitting, huh?
It's very popular right now.
Yeah.
I got to know some people in the hospitals, and they told me that Friday night was a tough night, as was Saturday night of 7. And I said, why Friday night? They said a lot of robberies, people get paid, and a lot of people get beat up and their money taken. And I said, why Saturday? Saturday, a lot of the men who were unhappy in their life got drunk, beat up their wives. So those were the two terrible nights in the hospital and the emergency room. And I'm sure it hasn't changed.
No, it's interesting because, that's what the TV show The Pit is kind of about. It's an example of a Friday night in an ER, and they're kind of doing what the TV show 24 did, where each episode is an hour of the shift. So
that's interesting. Now, I was going to say, Mike, that I heard that the Pit was being sued
by the
by the
people who
Michael
created
Crichton estate because there had been an ER reboot in consideration, but that went hasta la bye-bye, and now the Pit is in its place, and it may have to deal with some lawsuit ideas.
Well, it's going to be interesting because, going back, they'll have to sue, all these different doctor shows, because, ER, just because one of the actors from ER is on this new show. Because he plays the lead doctor on it now instead of the young doctor, which he started ER with, which is pretty cool.
That?
Noah Wiley.
You guys, when you were kids, like maybe when I was a kid, do you remember any of the kids who you hung around with who became doctors later on in life?
Yes.
Would you in going back retrospect, could you think that they would have become a doctor?
Not any
in
chance.
My case, I just whoa, to think that a couple of those guys became doctors is funny and scary.
When Stephen Bochco did Hill Street Blues, he peppered the background of all the scenes with people walking back and forth constantly. You thought that police precinct was like emptying out a sports stadium. The same thing applies to shows like ER and St. Elsewhere. There's a lot of activity going on in those ERs. You walk into a standard emergency room today, and even though there may be a lot of people in the waiting room, I find it's fairly quiet and sedate and under control. That wasn't the case in the ER. It looked like constant chaos in that emergency room, which I found compelling to watch.
It also depends where you work. If it was a trauma center, you're constantly busy because that's where the helicopters go. That's where all the big cases come. And
right.
So, and that's, I think, what they focus on for the TV. And there was a TV show in the 70s that I watched as a kid. It was called Emergency. And it dealt with both the firefighters and the paramedics, but also the hospital side. What happens to the patients after they get to the hospital, which is always interesting.
Well, the Chicago shows right now have a medical show. I mean, there's Chicago Fire about firemen. There's Chicago PD about cops. And then isn't it called Chicago Medical or
Chicago Hope? Chicago
Hope. So, yeah, it's part of the trilogy of shows devoted to what everybody talks about: doctor shows, lawyer shows, cop shows.
Mm-hmm.
Back to things like it happened in the movie Hospital. When I was 11 years old, put in the Bronx hospital, I had something called Osgood-Schlatter disease of my knee, and they had to put a plastic Paris cast on my leg. So I was put on a gurney with about 25 other people in the hallway of whatever they're doing, 7:00 in the morning. And I'm just laying on a gurney, waiting to get a cast put on my leg. And the doctor comes running down the hall, grabs me by the shoulder, and says, "Are you the appendectomy?" No, I'm not. Don't do that. Don't, please. So, a lot of adventure goes on in hospitals. A lot of great shows have come from them.
That sounds like a scene should be in the hospital, in the movie The Hospital.
I think they have a scene
in
where
that,
they have.
in that movie, they would probably take it out.
Well, that was actually one of the scenes where they operate on the wrong patient.
Yeah.
It's pretty. Watch, if you guys haven't seen The Hospital, all of our listeners, you're in for a real joyful, because Paddy Chayefsky, when he tackles a subject, he gives you quite a story.
That's a great movie. Oh, absolutely, yeah.
But
Tough movie.
The other thing I remember about Dr. Kildare was the music. It became, in fact, Richard Chamberlain, who was broke into stardom from the show, recorded an album of some of the songs featured on Dr. Kildare. And those were in the days when they had interesting title sequences for shows. Have you noticed the way that TV shows rarely now have themes anymore? They get right
to movies. Likewise, the movies.
Yeah.
Sound design.
Just saving money. That's why no commercials. We grew up with commercials always having songs. They don't want them anymore. They don't want to pay for them anymore. So
it's called sound design.
But except in radio, I don't know if you guys noticed it on the East Coast, but on the West Coast, every commercial now has a signature theme. All these ambulance chasing lawyers who are trying to get you to come on board to solve their, your personal injury lawyer types. They all have little jingles now. It's
just an aside with Richard Chamberlain.
Yes.
We went to see we went to see My Fair Lady about 25 years ago in Los Angeles. My Fair Lady at the Amazon Theater, big league production, and Richard Chamberlain was a star. And guys, this incredible, great show played as flat as a pancake. It was unthinkable, but it just laid an egg. It just lay there flat. There was nothing that came out. Julian, explain that. You're a Broadway producer. How could that happen? My Fair Lady.
Because he was miscast, and Melissa Errico was the girl, and you're talking versus Rex Harrison and Julie Andrews. I mean, casting, as we all four know, is an essential thing. And I can't even begin to tell you how many times we've watched, all of us, stuff where you say, my God, how could they cast this person? Well, there's a reason, and we don't know necessarily what that is. A quick story before we say goodbye. I got to know Paddy Chayefsky in New York, and he told me a story that he and Howard Gottfried were talking about the fact that George C. Scott missed a few days of shooting, and they were upset about it. And Howard Gottfried said to Paddy, we got to go in there and really let him have it and tell him we can't handle this kind of thing. So they both go to George C. Scott's trailer, and they knock on the door, and they hear, yeah, what is it? And they say, Paddy and Howard. And they go in, and he says, what do you want? And Howard Gottfried says, Paddy's got something to tell you.
I think I told you once that George C. Scott in the later years had a sign on his trailer, do not knock. So you basically just went, and if he was standing there in his underwear, so be it. He also was never far from a martini. At the TV Critics Conference once year, I had to walk around, one of my early jobs, I had to walk around carrying George's martini.
Well, I spent a lot of time with him personally in his home in both Connecticut and Los Angeles, and he was as good a friend as you could have, and really did try to advise me and talk to me about not going to take the deal I had at Paramount Pictures. He felt I wasn't right for a studio executive, and he was right. But
the role he played in Patton is probably as great as anything that's ever happened in movies.
Well, I was sitting on the couch. I was sitting on the couch with him when we did the remake of 12 Angry Men. And I leaned over and I said, George, I looked in your trailer and there was a Bible on the side of your bed. Do you read it often? And without breaking a sweat, he said, every goddamn day.
Well, I asked him, what was your favorite movie of all time? And I was sure he was going to say Patton. Without a beat, he said Dr. Strangelove.
Ah.
So
And he was unbelievable in that movie. Oh God. Yeah.
No, there was no medicine though. There was no medicine in Strange Love.
no,
Right.
but that was in the hospital though, Steve. So we're a little bit off again.
We
We've
were a
done it
little bit
again.
off.
Yes.
But I
One thing is for certain with doctor shows, medical shows, and movies is the audience has an insatiable appetite for them. They will continue on forever and ever. I will repeat that I don't think there's been a year since TV started that there wasn't a doctor show on television. People love these shows and the books and all kinds of things about doctors and medicine and anything related. So it's a good topic. Good topic to discuss.
You know, Matt, the most watched television episode in the history of television was the last episode of MASH.
Yeah, it's true. It
Even people who didn't watch MASH.
One of the best series finales was the St. Elsewhere's final, where they reveal, and I'm spoiling a show that's 30 years old now. So when they reveal that the whole series was just in the mind of the autistic child, and the hospital was in a snow globe that he had.
That sounds a little familiar. That sounds a little bit like Dallas ending with the dream sequence in the shower.
But that didn't
Who
end
shot
the show.
JR?
Yep. That's a whole different. We should do an episode about the best cliffhangers on TV.
Oh, I like that. That would be fun.
Actually, we should. We got The Sopranos. We've got Seinfeld. We got a lot that we could talk about on that.
Who was the one-armed man? You know, that type of thing. But,
Yes, definitely.
well, one other doctors we need to talk about, and, you know, as we're talking about, is doctors in science fiction. Because if you think...
Who?
Well, Doctor Who, of course.
And Bones.
But Dr. McCoy from Star Trek is huge for that. Because if you look at Star Trek and how it's affected the medical industry into the 21st century already, these little devices we have called cell phones are basically based off of what was created for Star Trek. And, you know, even hospitals nowadays, they have what they call a tricorder, where they can do body scans, and they can do, you know, for the hospitals, you go into a hospital now, it's computers everywhere, you know, with all the different readings. When Judy goes into the hospital, you know, they have literally all her medical history is right there on the computer, you know, for her whole life. And it's, you know, amazing what they do. And you can now see inside of your people's bodies. You could do, you know, all the vitals, all the things, just like in Star Trek. And it's just amazing how the technology has changed. And, you know, and it will continue to change as things, you know, continue to evolve.
And nothing's perfect. The other day I went for my medical checkup, 6-month checkups to the doctor. They took my blood pressure and it was completely wrong. The machine was out of sync. That happens too. Hey, you know.
So do doctors get out of sync? Usually they have 2 martinis or so.
Guy goes to a doctor and says, "Doc, I got a terrible problem with my memory. I can't remember anything. Is driving me crazy." And the doctor says, "How long has this been going on for?" And the guy says, "How long has what been going on for?"
Yeah.
All I can tell you is that if you're going to get sick today, it's good to be sick in the 2025s, because there's a lot more stuff that can help you than ever before.
For sure.
Ever before. So we're going to turn this wonderful show off over to, not off, we're going to turn
us off now? Okay, Steve.
To Mike Faber, who is the guidance counselor of our show.
Oh, I should be the psychiatrist for this show, more likely. You've reached out to the end of this episode of the Tales from Hollywoodland podcast. Always remember, we couldn't do this without you. We want to hear from you, so please write us anytime at talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. Remember, you can find us wherever fine podcasts are found, and now you can even find us up on our YouTube channel. If you made it this far into the episode, why not subscribe and give us a thumbs up? Or if you're listening to us, please give us 5 stars. If you're into social media, please check out us on Instagram and Facebook. before we get out of here, let's see what the guys and see what's happening this week on their podcast. Julian, who are you talking to this week?
This week is Paula Prentice, and Paula Prentice will be talking about that movie called Where the Boys Are, where we all discovered Paula Prentice and Man's Favorite Sport and Stepford Wives and so many other movies. Parallax View with Warren Beatty. Very interesting actress, and I'm looking forward to talking to her.
Julian, do you talk about In Harm's Way?
Yes, In Harm's Way, we'll do that too.
Good, because I'm writing an article about the making of that show, so I may need some help from you.
Okay, all right.
Ask her about Tom Tryon, one of my favorite actors.
Yeah, I got to know him. I'll talk about that off the air with you.
Okay.
Steve, what's going on your show?
Marcia Clark, who was the lead prosecutor in the O.J. Simpson case, has written a book about the life and trial of Barbara Graham, a character played by Susan Hayward in the 1958 film I Want to Live, where she won the Best Actor Oscar that year. And Marcia's book is fascinating. It goes deeply into how the case was mismanaged. And it's basically, the title of the book is called Trial by Ambush, and it's a very, very truthful title. So she's my guest. I'm looking forward to that.
Awesome.
That should be a terrific show, Steve. That
Yes.
really should be a terrific show.
Thank you.
Arthur, what are we talking about on our show next week?
Marcia Clark was also portrayed by Sarah Paulson brilliantly in the TV show. Next week, we're talking about famous sexy scenes in movies. There was one as an example in the movie called Body Heat, where only 2 words described the scene, and that was "Don't Stop." You'll understand it more if you look at the movie, but it's a great topic we're going to talk about next week.
Yes, and if you notice, none of us who are up on this podcast were involved in all those sexy scenes that we're going to be talking about next week. So there you go.
Well, we'll talk about that next week.
On behalf of Steve, Arthur, and Julian, thanks again for listening. This is your producer and announcer, Mike Faber, and we will see you here next time on Tales from Hollywoodland. Your Hollywood adventure starts right here.
Lighter here. Wish you could keep up on DC Comics but don't have the time or the money? Not a problem. Join Cletus Jacobs and I as we bring you recaps and commentary on DC Comics, television, movies, and more, whether they are good or not. The Earth Station DCU podcast comes out weekly and is part of the ESO Network.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping for the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.